Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program with our guest speaker, Dr. Clayton Tyne. Thanks to Dr. Tyne and to everyone who has joined us online today. I am Iyad Saeed, Assistant Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at Mount Mercy University and a member of the Board of Directors of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, members, sponsors, and partners for their support. This list includes the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Program, Honors Program, and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, City Channel 4 for providing online access to ICFRC's program, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are located. You are already muted, so we ask you to please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation so you do not interrupt our speaker. Following our speaker's presentation at about 12:45, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clayton Tyne, who will speak about coup d'etat, causes, consequences, and opportunities for research and policy. Dr. Clayton Tyne is a professor in the Political Science Department in the University of Kentucky. He currently serves as the department chair, having previously held positions as Director of Graduate Studies and as the co-founder and director of the Peace Studies Certificate Program. Dr. Tyne's research focuses on domestic conflict and instability, coup d'etat, regime types and democratization, and international education policy. His most recent work focuses on coup d'etat, civil war onset, and civil war duration. His book, How International Relations Affect Civil Conflict, Cheap Signals, Costly Consequences, was published by Lexington Books in 2009. He has published numerous articles in well-known academic and scholarly journals. He received his PhD from the University of Iowa in 2007, his MA from University of Iowa in 2004, his MED from the University of St. Thomas in Houston in 2003, and BA from University of Nebraska, Kearney in 2001. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Clayton Tyne.
All right, thank you so much for that great introduction. Thanks everybody for coming. I can't tell you how big of an honor it is to be able to speak with such an illustrious group. I checked out this group on the website and we chatted a little bit before this got going. It sounds like an amazingly impressive group in terms of background, but just the goal of this group is really interesting. It makes me feel good about what I do for a living. And also as a Hawkeye, it's just always really fun to be invited back to chat with people. So with that, I'll share my screen. And I'll do my best to keep track of time. I'm usually pretty good on pacing. So right now, yeah, you're seeing my screen. So this is the introduction. You got my email there, but I do love mixing it up with people. So don't be scared to email me anytime or give me a call. We'll chat about whatever. So the talk outline, here's what I think we're going to go over, or what I plan on going over. Just the basic what a coup is, why should we care about coups, generally what causes them, and then I'm going to dive into some original research just so you can see kind of the cutting edge of what some people are working on and what I'm finding interesting. So first, what is a coup? So I guess I started this about a decade ago. moving to coup research. And the first thing my co-author, he was a grad student at that time, and I found is that nobody had defined coups. So if you want to know the definition of coups, I wrote that, the definition of coups. But usually when we think about any event, we think about three things: who did what to whom. So with coups, the who question is that the perpetrators of a coup have to military or some elite within the state apparatus. It's almost always the military. 18 times since 1950 have there been a coup that wasn't led by the military. And usually the high-ranking military leaders. They're almost always generals or at least colonels. So that's who can perpetrate a coup. I cannot perpetrate a coup. You cannot. If it's going to come up later, I'll just give you right now, January 6th was not a coup. We should not call it a coup. The people that were in the Capitol were not elite or military of the apparatus. More than that, what did they do? The big thing we're looking at is illegal and overt attempts. So we don't cover plots. These actually, so one, they have to be legal, which you might be surprising to you. It's actually pretty easy to tell if it's illegal. Each constitution from across the world has very clear order of succession. So we do have to become constitutional scholars for a second when we code these things, but it's pretty easy to tell if something's illegal. And then finally, to whom it must challenge the sitting executive. So that's the other reason why January 6th wasn't a coup. It's because it was really against Congress. It wasn't against Trump. So the person that you have to go after is the sitting executive. So that's a conceptual definition of a coup. And then we say it's successful if they hold power for at least 7 days. That's a bit arbitrary. We have better definitions now that we use, but that's one most people still use from my research over a decade ago now. In terms of coups over time, and I'll show you by region over time in a bit, but they used to be hot and they've gone down, which is a good thing overall. But we have seen a spike over the last year and a half. 7 coups over the last year. So we've seen a spike. I think those are kind of tied to COVID, kind of tied to several things, but they're kind of hot, or at least getting hotter. But certainly over time, since the end of the Cold War, that you can see that they've plummeted, both successful and failed coups. The geographic spread, and again, I'm going to show you a line figure of this, but really when we're thinking about coups, old school coups, we're thinking primarily South America, Latin America. Today's coups, some people call this the coup belt across Africa, but today's coups are primarily either Southeast Asia, Thailand's a hotbed of coups, here across Africa, or some in the Middle East. Showing you the research over time, and the frequency of coups over time. Like I said, that Africa's always been kind of a hotbed of coups, and the spike in coups recently has been almost exclusively within that coup belt in Africa. America's, their time of coups is pretty much done. They were the hottest place for coups, but we haven't seen a coup in Latin America since, I believe, Honduras might have been the last one. It's been a while since we had a coup in the Americas. Asia is, if anybody, they usually are number 2 or number 3 on coups. But that's, like I said, isolated a couple of states, Southeast Asia primarily. Europe's almost no coups. The one coup, though, you may have heard of the third wave of democratization. That was really kicked off by a coup sitting right here in 1974 in Portugal that ended the Nova Estada regime and really ushered in a third wave of democratization. But since then, coups have largely gone away, which probably doesn't surprise you. And then finally, the Middle East, a little bit of growth there in coups, but overall, we see them going down, and it probably is not going to surprise you that today's coups are primarily in Africa. The opposite of coups is coup research. So what I did with this is I just put the word coup in a search engine, looking for peer-reviewed articles that use the word coup in the title, in all political science journals here. And what you can see is an explosion of research on coups. So when coups were hot back here, and I started in 1980 because, I mean, that seemed like enough for me. That was a lot of searching. But back here, there was basically nothing going on with coups, a few books every now and then, but not many. But today, coups is really one of the hotter research areas, I think, going on in political science. A lot of that has to do, I think, with famous coups, with us looking for stuff to study. But two main reasons, I think. One is just the recognition that coups are a big deal, and we should understand them more. But second, I'm going to pat myself on the back. I mean, part of the reason that we see an explosion is because prior to 2011, we didn't really have a good data set to analyze coups. So that definition I showed you earlier, that was also combined with a new data set on coups that we update every time there's a new coup. So now we actually have stuff to study, and other people have now produced alternative data sets to ours. So the data on coups has gotten much better. So now moving to the second part of my presentation here is why should we care, right? What do coups do that we should care about? And coups do a lot of things. So the first one is just bad economic outcomes. And so coups we usually study as a dependent variable. If you're looking for a research question, I think coups is an independent variable. Is there's a lot of stuff to be studied. But coups, it probably won't surprise you too much. GDP goes down. So here I'm showing you what happened to Egypt following there. This is the 2013 coup that overthrew Morsi, but you can see the economy plummeted. We'll talk about military expenditures more in a bit, trying to keep the military happy so they don't overthrow you again. Of course, coups lead to military involvement in politics, often very directly, right? The junta just takes power and keeps power, or they may transfer power over to a civilian, but they keep a tight hold on it. And as you may or may not know, but likely suspect, militaries are really bad at running countries, right? They're good at fighting, but they're not very good at filling potholes and monetary policy and education and things like that. Debt costs, again, not going to surprise you that nobody's going to want to loan to a country that just had a coup. That's a really good way to lose your cash. And then the currency depreciation. I mean, basically the economy goes into shambles following your average coup. The political outcomes, again, are usually bad. So they lead to lots of things. These pro-government militias. A way to avoid coups is to hammer your military, make it very weak, or ethnically cleanse it, or ethnically divide it. We'll talk about that in a bit with the guardianship dilemma. But probably the biggest one that we think about is violence and repression. So even a failed coup, if you think about Turkey, I mean, Turkey had a democracy. Erdogan was never a good guy, but he wasn't as bad as he is now following their failed coup attempt. So violence and repression. Here's an example here I just put up here of people shot dead following the coup in Sudan somewhat recently. Other reasons we should care, this is getting into the guardianship dilemma. So this isn't necessarily the effect of the coup directly, it's more the effects of preventing coups. So this figure I'm showing you here, just to kind of set it up, is that these are the way that ruling parties gain power, and they're good things for the most part, right, through elections. Coups is way down the list. But when we look at how ruling parties lose power, the number one way is through coups. So leaders know this, and leaders are very smart at trying to stay in power. And so this yields what we call the guardianship dilemma. But the guardianship dilemma is just at its simplest level, the idea that you want a strong military to protect the country, but all that military has to do is turn around and point the guns at you, and now you're being overthrown in a coup. So the leaders, authoritarian leaders in particular, have a really tough dilemma in how are they going to build a strong military to protect the country, while not making it too strong that they can overthrow themselves. So again, these aren't direct effects of coups, but these effects I'm about to show you are the effects of leaders trying to make sure that the military does not overthrow them. So these effects are in many ways. So the first one I'm showing here is this, we call it guns for butter. And if you want to see it on a figure, it's here. But basically, there's this guns and butter are sort of metaphors. Guns, not so much. Guns is just basically military expenditures, and butter is things like what other healthcare expenditures or education. But there's just an inverse relationship between these. You can't do everything at once. So when when there's a fear of a coup or an actual coup, we see budgetary expenditure shifted to the military. We see it shifted to the guns, which means that there's just less pie left over to do things like healthcare and education. Again, military involvement in politics, a way to make sure they don't overthrow you in a coup is to bring them into the cabinet, right? And to give them large say over what you're doing. Co-opting opposition, like those who could potentially overthrow you, you keep them happy. These could be just direct payments, right? So this is, if you remember the Arab Spring, how Saudi Arabia basically stayed out of that mess. They just cut checks to people, right? Gave people money. But that's very expensive, and it's rarely done in a legitimate manner. Next thing you do is fragment your military, and I mentioned this earlier, but you split it up by ethnicity. We call this increasing coordination obstacles. So you make it hard for one branch or one unit to get along with the other unit. Thus, the likelihood that they all come together and overthrow you in a coup goes down. You often divide them by ethnicity. Coups can, or what this can all do then, especially these two, if we're talking about fragmenting the military and dividing them along ethnic lines, you make them weaker. You make them less effective, right? We don't do this in the United States. We don't divide our military based on ethnic lines. We don't make them mutually suspicious, right? We let them play football against each other, right? Everybody likes the Army-Navy game, but at the end of the day, they're on the same team. And so when you do divide them that way, you can get civil wars, you can get attacked by other countries, and you don't want to be a part of an alliance with a coup-prone country, because you don't know who you're going to be dealing with tomorrow. And so coups, I've shed a pretty negative light, and by and large it is a negative light, but coups can do good things. They can open up a window of opportunity for democratization and elections. They can end civil wars with new leadership. So the example I wanted to show you here is what happens to democracy, because this is pretty important stuff, but this figure's a little bit hard to get your mind wrapped around, but let me explain it real quick. So this axis here is what the country was 7 days before the coup, and here's what it looks like 7 days after the coup. And so, like an ideal situation, what we'd love to see is a coup that overthrows an autocracy, a really bad regime, and then 2 years later it becomes a full democracy, and you can see there's zero values there. Okay, but by and large, what happens is a coup overthrows a regime and replaces it with the exact same regime. All right, so in the examples here, like these, we have 4 coups that overthrew a democracy and returned it to a democracy. It doesn't happen very often. But your modal category for coups, it overthrows a bad regime and it replaces it with another bad regime, right? So usually nothing changes with coups, or nothing drastic. Or the next, or I guess the biggest one, that's 91 stayed the same. These are the ones where things got worse, right? Where we started with a democracy, it was overthrown by a coup, and it became an autocracy down here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. I believe you can. And then the last ones are the ones where things got better. And again, these are pretty rare that they get better, but still, part of the reason I like coups is they can get things better, right? So when we look at rough situations going on around the globe, even, what if we could wave a magic wand and change something about the Ukraine-Russian conflict, a coup would be something I'm thinking about there, right, to change that conflict. They're not great options, but, compared to invading Russia or a direct fight with Russia, these are better options. So next, the third part of my talk here, my pacing seems reasonable, so I think I'm doing all right. Why do they happen? So I'm going to start with this theoretical framework and then apply some general concepts we have to it before I go to original research. There are 2 main things we think about with coups, and basically what we're trying to do is get in the mind of the generals here. And the first one's disposition, right? Do I got good salary? Do I have cool guns, right? Do I have good weapons? Do I feel like I'm secure? That's how badly I want to seize power. And then the second one is whether or not you can actually do it if you wanted to, right? And so you can be as disgruntled as you want to be, but if you're just going to get overthrown by a counter coup, what's the point, right? You're better off staying at home. So who's going to join your side? Do you actually have the capabilities defeating the palace? So what we do is we put these on a 2x2, or I guess a 1x1 framework, disposition and ability. And this is basically how I think about the world when I'm thinking about coups. And so the basic idea, if your ability is high, you can seize power. You're pretty confident you can, and you're very upset, then the probability of a coup is high. And if it's the opposite case, if you're very coup-proof military, there's no way to coordinate everybody to get them on the same page, and you're getting paid well anyway, you've got a low coup probability. So let's set this up in general, how we think about it. And so the sort of target here I got here, if you're paid well, you have good weapons, you're happy, your disposition goes down, you're not very disposed to have a coup. And then your ability, right? If you can't defeat the palace, you don't think others are going to jump on your side, you're never going to see a coup. So based on this framework, why do coups happen? So the simplest reason is that this sort of thing takes a lot of resources. If you want this target in the bottom left, right? If you're going to pay leaders, military, a lot of money in salaries, you're going to give them the weapons they want. You're going to reduce the coordination obstacles. You're going to keep the people happy so they don't join and celebrate a coup. You better be a rich country, right? And so this is why the United States doesn't have coups. We're never going to have a coup, is because there's no way you're going to get the military leaders to agree to do this, right? They might have the ability a little bit. I don't know. We have a huge military. It'd be hard to get everybody on the same side. But they don't have the disposition at all. I mean, being a general in the U.S. military or an admiral is a pretty good gig, right? But most countries don't have the kind of money we have. So even beyond that resource thing, the puzzle is that executives have a lot of control over this stuff, right? So they can sit along anywhere here how they want to. So two examples here are the first one, the bottom right, that's Mubarak. So he had a very, very strong military. So it had the ability to overthrow him if they wanted to. They just weren't disposed to overthrow him, right, on the bottom right, until we had major Arab Spring protests, but he was able to stay in power for 35 years. Idi Amin on the top left, he did sort of an opposite thing, right? He divided his military into groups, really fragmented by ethnicity, but also just weakened them so much that they couldn't really do anything. I mean, they couldn't go hunting if they wanted to. Their weapons were so bad. He was held in power really by mercenaries. So they had, maybe were disposed to do it, but they had no ability to do it. They just couldn't overthrow him. So what then leads to coups? Really, it shocks lead to coups, right? Because leaders are very good at towing that ability and disposition line to stay in power. This is why dictators can stay in power so long. So for example, protests, right? So this is the Arab Spring coup. This is how Mubarak got overthrown. There are massive protests. What's that do? That increases the military's disposition to overthrow the leader, because now they're kind of worried about a full-scale revolution at that point. In a full-scale revolution, they lose their jobs, they may go to jail. They don't want that to happen. They want the regime to stay intact, to at least keep their privileged position, even if they have to swap out the leader with a coup. But protests also change the ability of leaders. They think they're going to be able to successfully seize and hold power because the people are on their side. And so yeah, but these protests are really shocks. These are sorts of things that the leaders don't necessarily see coming. So, if you had to put like Iran today in this framework, I would say ability is reasonably high, but the disposition is probably still pretty low. It's going to be hard for the Iranian military to think that they're going to keep privileged positions and stay in power if there is a full-scale revolution. So I wouldn't predict a coup in Iran. It's bigger today than it was a year ago, but still lower than one might expect. All right, so generally what leads to coups, what leads to or prevents them. It's not going to surprise you that economics has a lot to do with it. So I have this figure here of Myanmar, or I'm sorry, Thailand, and their economic crises, and these red dots then are when the coups happen. Not all of them happened during economic downturns, but most of them happened during economic downturns, which likely doesn't surprise you. And some of those were also had protests due to the economic downturns. But a GDP is a great indicator of coups. Capitalist ties lead to fewer coups, and the more you trade with other countries. Basically, the moral of the story with international relations is that the more international actors pay attention through either trade or whatever alliances, the fewer coups we're going to see. And then natural resources, that this is the same with civil wars, but they increase the prize of winning the state. So Myanmar, I have an example there where you can make a lot of cash from a coup, from overthrowing a country, if you have lootable resources. The second one is politics. Again, might not surprise you all that much, but coups are least frequent in really strong authoritarian regimes and really strong democracies. Where they happen is in sort of the middle area. And so really strong authoritarian regimes like Saddam Hussein, I've got a picture there, and Vladimir Putin, really strong authoritarian regimes. It's almost impossible to organize people because they've been coup-proofed, and then the consequences for failing are drastic. They're gonna kill you, obviously, but probably your family and all your neighbors, right? Women in power, one of these things that I don't pick your dependent variable. The more women we have in power, the better that dependent variable is going to look. The same is true with coups. Elections reveal weaknesses in authoritarian legislatures. These are sort of ways that authoritarians can try to stay in power. If those elections reveal weaknesses, coups can happen. But those authoritarian legislatures, that's a way to sort of credibly commit to giving some power to the opposition group. They lead to fewer coups. So politics certainly matters. It's not just economics, and the political system matters. The final one I'm going to talk about here in terms of general factors is the international factors. And so part of the reason the coups plummeted at the end of the Cold War, I showed you that figure earlier, it was really due to international organizations, particularly the OAS in South America and the African Union, or the OAU at that time, and now the African Union. But they have really clear, strong policies condemning coups. So if you stage a coup in Latin America or in Africa, the likelihood of you getting hammered, suspended, and sanctioned by the other members is pretty high. And so what this did is it provided a lot of consistency and transparency of how the international community will react to coups. It's still not as consistent as I'd want it to be, but I credit the international community and international organizations with the big decline in coups since the end of the Cold War. It wasn't just them. The EU's got a fairly strong anti-coup policy. The United States stopping meddling and inspiring coups helped. But primarily, I point to those two. Peacekeeping, blue helmets in the country, probably doesn't surprise you, leads to fewer coups. Rivalries, when you have an external actor that you can blame for everything, right? And everybody gets on board with that. That makes it really hard to overthrow the leader because people are already rallied behind that leader. And then, as I mentioned earlier with trade, alliance is a similar thing, that the more the international actors are paying attention, the fewer coups we're going to see. And then the final thing that transitions in my original research is what the civilians think, right? And so this is sort of, I'd say, I'm going to call it the least studied area of research, and the reason why this is what I'm looking at, because most coup research is focused on the military, civil military relations, and that makes sense as a starting point. But I think the average people, you and me, matter quite a bit. And we know that primarily through protests, all right? So we know for sure that popular uprisings increases the likelihood of coups. A bunch of us have shown that. Civil wars lead to more coups. Inequality, horizontal inequality, that's inequality between groups, often ethnic groups. That leads to coups, but we honestly don't know all that much about how you and I and the normal person influences coups. So that should transition to my original research where I'm looking at the normal people. What are they up to? And this is more of a contextual factor that I think influences coups. It's not one of these triggering events like a massive protest. It's more of like we think about GDP or something like that, how it influences the setting where coups are more or less likely to transpire. And I'm interested in how education matters, right? How educating little kids and you and me, how that influences coups. And so the theory is that education should lead to a lower likelihood of coup. That's my hypothesis. And there are 5 main reasons behind this. So the first causal mechanism, when we think about how education matters, it increases civic engagement, right? So we know that education leads to better democracies or democratization, but this figure here at the bottom is just kind of the different ways that people get involved. It can be all the way for, running for office or being an activist. It can just be simple things like helping your neighbor and having coffee and chatting about things. But the more educated you are, the more you're thinking about politics, the more you're thinking about what the government's up to. So getting people talking, right? Another thing is the cross-cultural competency. So what leaders will do with this guardianship dilemma I mentioned is divide the military by ethnic groups, or they're gonna find an enemy. So I talked about rivalries against other states. Well, rivalries can also happen within the state, right? Where you demonize some group. That's really hard to do when people are highly educated, right? This figure I'm showing here. This is part of what we're trying to instill in students from kindergarten on up, right? We're trying to get people to acknowledge each other. And there was a nice statement at the beginning about the land that we live on not belonging to us originally, right? We learn these things through education. So these cross-cultural competencies, it makes it really hard for leaders to demonize others in order to get people behind them. Critical thinking skills, and this is usually developed more in the higher levels of education, but we try to do it. I used to be a 3rd grade teacher, then a 5th grade teacher. I tried to do it there, but here as a university professor, it's basically all about critical thinking skills. But this critical thinking, I'll mention in a minute, that part of the key to overthrowing a leader in a coup is convincing people that you just did a good thing, right? So they don't protest, and so there isn't a counter coup. Well, when you have critical thinking skills and you can look at data and you can think about how the government should work, and what are good moves and good options, then it's really hard to come to the conclusion that coup was a good thing, right? So thus the leaders are less likely to coup in the first place. And so I guess 3 and 4 are kind of tied, but understanding the harm that can come from coups, right? So I just have a picture here of this is the coup in Chile that brought in Pinochet, but coups have led to some of the worst atrocities we've seen throughout time, really. But coups can lead to good things, but by and large, they lead to really bad things. And it's really hard to convince people that a coup is going to end up being the right thing to do. And then finally, understanding the other forms that you can change society, right? So there's all kinds of ways we can change society, right? And then we got elections, and you can overthrow the incumbent in an election. We've got peaceful ways to do this. We could be a foreign intervention, but there are all kinds of ways we can change our government and petition our governments in order to get changes. And a coup might be a way to do it, but it might not be the best way, right? So the more educated we are, the more we think critically about what is the best way to transform government to get what we want. And like I said, rarely are educated people going to come to the conclusion that the coup was the right thing to do. So yeah, that's my theory. That's my theoretical expectations, and my timing still looks good. So I don't know how much we're going to want to see from data, but I at least want to show you some evidence. Basically, we dump this in a model. We try to predict coups. We have some control variables to hold things constant. If you know anything about the coup empirical research, there's nothing weird about what I'm doing here. And I'll fly through this a little bit. Basically, if you know how to read this stuff, the idea is that everything's behaving as we should expect. So this number, this negative 2.94, if you remember y equals mx plus b, this is kind of your y, or I'm sorry, this is kind of your m. This is your slope. So the relationship between GDP per capita and coups is negative, which means that coups are less likely the richer the state gets. But all these are behaving how we would expect. And then what I really care about is this, and they're behaving exactly how we should suspect, right? As education for men or women gets stronger, the likelihood of coups goes down. This first difference is, I don't have time to explain, but let me just say it's a way of figuring out what matters the most. And so when I'm looking at any independent variable, I always like to compare to GDP per capita. And so this figure kind of puts education and GDP per capita on the same scale. So you're talking apples to apples. And we see that GDP per capita, it matters in reducing coups, but education actually matters more. And so two things interesting about this, I think. Well, I guess just one thing that's really interesting is that when we think about, independent variables that influence things like coups, what I'm always looking for is something that you can actually change, right? And some things you just can't change, like terrain or forest. They're just really hard to change. Population demographics, really hard to change. Education is something you can change. It's going to cost some money, right? But you can actually change education systems. GDP per capita, you can also change that, but guess what? Everybody's already trying to do that, right? Every leader wants a better economy. But education is one of these things that you can make a conscious decision to improve education and dramatically improve education without necessarily breaking the bank. I mean, you can make these things happen in countries. The next thing, I got time to extend the theory. I think I'm supposed to go to 145. The two things I extend this with, basically the idea is that we got this relationship between education and coups, but under what context does that matter the most, right? Where should we look for to find that relationship either getting stronger or weaker? And so the two things I looked at was how the democracy is doing and how the economy is doing. And in terms of theory, the big thing here that I'm considering is, like, in order to stage a coup and seize and maintain power for the long term, what you largely have to do is trick the population into thinking that that was a good thing, right? And so when we look at tricking people or things like this, people getting duped, we see that education is correlated with a lot of this stuff. So weak education, the two I have here is gambling and believing Trump's big lie, but weak education's the people that are responding and losing money from the Nigerian prince that emails you, those are rarely educated people, right? And the people that get scammed, I mean, not that they're bad people or anything, but they're usually people with weaker educations. So the context I'm thinking with this is basically that the people that are going to be basically impossible to trick into thinking a coup is a good thing are educated people, especially if they live in rich countries or in democracies, right? So you and I living in the United States, it's basically impossible to convince us that a coup could ever be good. And thus the coup is going to be less likely because every general out there knows in the United States that the population is a highly educated population living in a democracy that has a lot of money. And so a coup is not even going to cross their mind because we would go nuts if there was a coup, right? We would not accept that. So these numbers basically say that, hey, I'm right. If you want it in a figure, the y-axis here is the effect of coups on, or I'm sorry, the effect of education on coups, basically how that slope changes as democracy here and then as GDP per capita here increase. And what we see is that slope gets stronger, right? So that negative relationship gets even more negative if you're living in a wealthy country or a democracy. So yeah, the conclusion, yeah, timing's perfect. I'm so happy. The conclusion is education matters, leads to fewer coups, especially if you're in democracy, if you're in a wealthy country. I think there's plenty of room to consider things among the domestic population beyond protests. Education is one of these, but I think healthcare, I think we could do a lot more with the structure of the government, but the participation in the government, trust in the government. I think there are all kinds of variables that we have among the domestic population that sets the framework. for coups, for understanding what generals are thinking. And then finally, just the last point here, the stuff on education, what I showed you, it probably doesn't surprise you too much. It aligns with people that look at education across a wide variety of dependent variables, civil wars, economic development, democratization. Just like how I told you earlier that more women in power always leads to good things, more education inevitably leads to good things. So with that, I'm gonna quit sharing my screen, and I would be so delighted to hear any questions or comments y'all might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tyne. We now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. Feel free to turn on your video function, but please keep yourself muted. While we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank its members and donors for their support. If you would like to join ICFRC or to make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you. And I believe we have our...
Yeah, so Dr. Mitchell put a question in the chat box, and I'm her student, so she should have pulled her punches, but she did not pull her punches at all. Two tough questions. Appreciate you saying it's an interesting talk, Dr. Mitchell. So first, she says, what factors distinguish the cases that get the better, same, or worse in terms of regime type after coups? Dr. Mitchell and everybody, so this stuff, I think we need to study more. I mean, I've done a little bit of work on this. And so what I've looked at least is how the international community reacts to the coup. So basically, so say there's a coup in whatever, Egypt, right? And the international community, like the United States, reaches out and tries to support that, then we might see leaders hedging more towards democracies. If they get hammered by democracies, their only option to stay in power is to yield towards authoritarian regimes. So I think the international communities, both states and international organizations, their reactions to coups matters a lot. And so I've got hammered on this more than once, but I'm going to stick with it, is that when there's a coup, we shouldn't necessarily have a negative reaction to the coup. We need to think long and hard about what that reaction should be, because most coups don't overthrow democracies. So whether or not that coup was good or bad is something we need to stop and take a deep breath, because I think some of these coups could be good. Second part, a lot of variables I mentioned explain coups and civil wars. What's unique for explaining onset of coups? Gosh, I don't know. Yeah, your baseline variables aren't going to change a whole lot. Some of the things that explain civil wars aren't going to explain coups, like population's not going to matter as much, terrain is not going to matter as much, right? So my focus is always on international actors. I mean, I think the consistency of international actors towards coups and what they did with the last coup is probably something that would stick out to me. So civil wars last long and people get tired of them real quickly, but that signal that's sent immediately following coups sets up the scenario for the next coup plotters. Our pro-government militia is something that could influence coups more than civil wars. We need to have a talk about this. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I would say, so we've got pro-government militias as a dependent variable with coups, but I'm not sure about an independent variable with coups. And my instinct would be, yeah, I mean, because you could use the pro-government militias as sort of a second guard for your palace. But I wish I had better answers for this, Sarah. I mean, we know some stuff, but some of the stuff I'm going to have to talk off the top of my head and just kind of guess, if that makes some sense. But overall, yeah, it's not the coup. I guess the tie between coups and civil wars, we should expect to be very strong because the population matters in both, right? In a lot of the similar ways. I mean, one, the population, civil wars, the population is actually often fighting. But the second part is for coups, if the population doesn't support that coup, then the coup will probably never happen in the first place. But if it does, there's going to be a counter coup, right? So the population matters in both scenarios. Yeah. So the second one you got there's a comment by splitting his go-to. Or go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were done.
Oh shoot.
Uh,
I missed one up here.
oh no, it's all right. I have another question as well. It says, based on your analysis, what countries do you think are the most likely candidates for a coup to occur?
Yeah. We're still in that coup belt in Africa today. I mean, that's the covariates you saw in that model are still going to be worse in Africa. But I think that part of the bigger thing, I mean, I mentioned COVID earlier, is that right now the international community's got their hands full and they're just not paying attention to what's going on. And I think this is part of the reason we had the spike during COVID, but still people aren't paying attention to what's going on, right? And so you're less likely to hammer a junta that overthrew somebody in a coup because it's not even going to make the news today. And same thing with Ukraine and Russia. I mean, it's sucking up a lot of attention. So if I'm a coup plotter wherever in Guinea-Bissau, I saw that somebody wrote, now's a good time to do it. Like that might not even make the headlines, right? That might not make the nightly news if there's a coup. People have their hands full with other stuff. Okay, so what things could help build trust in this culture of coups in Guinea-Bissau? You know, I got to point to just the covariates we already looked at, right? But leaders at least trying to do well. And so this, I'm going to just go back to education because that's what I know and that's what I care about and I know it matters. But my earlier research looked at how education influences civil wars, and the actually biggest effect I found on that was that it was the primary education, right? So it's and little kids, 8-year-olds don't fight. They're not rebels, right? But I found that the primary education had the biggest effect on whether or not a civil war begins. And the reason why, I think, what I argued anyway, is that that's a way for the government to signal that it's trying, that it actually cares, right? So if governments actually care and truly want to change things, nothing matters more than investing in our kids, right? That's the one thing we all agree upon and we all care about. So that would be a way, but I mean, really you just gotta, I mean, elections go a long way, right? But doing things to allow people to express their viewpoints in a way that's nonviolent and not illegal, if that makes some sense. Let's see. Is that what I got? What timeline and metrics to say a coup failed or not? So the simplest one we used to use is just whether or not they seized and held power for 7 days to define success. But the more recent one I've looked at is we basically coded how long that regime stays in power, or so it's not just the regime. So other data sets have how long a leader stays in power, or how long it like remains a democracy or something like that. What we actually looked at is from the time the junta took over to when somebody new that they didn't want took over, basically, right? So we have juntas that'll just hand power to the next guy, and so it's a continuous measure of time that we look at for a dependent variable to define success. It's a little tougher one to get at. Climate shocks lead to coups, not that we know. We've got one estimate that says the answer is yes, that it's climate shocks is the instrumented variable for the economy though. So it's not like the theory was about climate shocks. The answer is we're not sure. From what I
Piggyback on that question, originally from Syria, and I heard a theory that one reason that the revolution in Syria started was due to climate and to lack of water in the northeast of Syria. I'm not an expert, so I don't know how much that is true.
I don't know, Sarah, you can jump in at any time you want because you're up on the Civil War literature as much as I am nowadays. But I think it's still pretty rough in terms of a clear XY causal relationship between the climate and either coups or civil wars, right? It's just, it changes so slowly that it seems to set the context for things. And so theoretically, I think we all agree that this stuff matters. But in terms of showing causation between one and the other, we're talking about going up a degree of Celsius in what, like 20 years. It's really, really hard to say X leads to Y. It's probably, more careful that acted as a threat multiplier. Yeah, I mean, we know that like bad climate leads to fewer crops, right? And hungry people get frustrated and rebel, right? So what's the actual causal mechanism going there? It's not going to be good. But those relationships is so hard to show, I think. They work in theory. So you have to believe the correlation, even if it's not as clear cut empirically. Got anything else from anybody?
I'm not seeing any.
Well, let me say again that it's been an honor to chat with you all, and I hope that's what you're looking for out of a presentation. I wasn't sure how much of it to do research or how much data or how much background, but I did my best to try to lump all those things together. So hopefully it was useful, but if not, you only burn 51 minutes of your life, right?
Well, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. So I think it is time for us to conclude our program. I want to express our thanks to Dr. Clayton Tyne for his excellent presentation and for sharing his expertise with us today. Clayton, I am honored to virtually present you with ICFRC's highly coveted mug for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. Catherine is holding it right there. We will arrange delivery of your mug very soon. Our program next week features Dr. David Quirty, who will speak about using the UN Sustainable Development Goals to train tomorrow's sustainability leaders. This program, which is in collaboration with the Johnson County UN Association, will be held in person and online on Wednesday, October 26 at 12 noon. ICFRC will send out the email announcement and the registration link tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Thank you again, Dr. Clayton Tyne, and thank you for joining us today, everyone. We are adjourned.